She counted the steps to the ballroom door because counting was the only thing she could still do without trembling. 12 from the carriage, 6 across the gravel, 3 up the marble. She held a small gloved hand in each of hers, and the children, sensing the gravity of the night the way small animals sense weather, did not ask questions they had already been told not to ask. The footman at the door looked at her face and forgot, for a full heartbeat, what it was he had been instructed to do. Then he remembered. He bowed. He opened. Inside, the orchestra was playing a quadrille she had once danced badly and laughed through, and the candles were lit in such number that the chandeliers seemed to be holding small constellations in their fists. There were 500 people in that room, perhaps more. She knew most of them by name. None of them, yet, knew that she was there. The herald, an elderly man with a voice like a struck bell, drew a breath he had drawn 10,000 times for 10,000 arrivals, and looked at the card she had pressed into his hand. He read it. He read it again. He looked up at her, and at the boy on her right, and at the girl on her left, and his composure, which had survived 3 coronations and a fire in the West Wing, faltered for the first time in 40 years. He cleared his throat. He squared his shoulders. He stepped to the head of the marble stair. "Her Grace," he announced, and his voice carried the way it was meant to carry, over the violins, over the laughter, over the soft chink of crystal touching crystal. "Her Grace, the Duchess of Ashendel, and the Lady Cordelia, and the Lord Tobias." For a moment, the room behaved as a room is taught to behave when something incomprehensible has been said inside it. The music did not stop. The dancing did not stop. The footman did not stop pouring. Only the small private silences inside each guest stopped, and that was enough. Heads turned. Fans paused mid-flutter. A glass somewhere near the cake was set down too hard. At the far end of the ballroom, beside a tower of white roses and 3 tiers of sugarwork in which a swan had been carved as if from snow, a man in dark blue with a single decoration on his coat lifted his head as though someone had spoken his true name for the first time in 4 years. And beside him, on his arm, a young woman in pale aquamarine, who had practiced this evening in her mirror for a month, felt her own smile freeze at the edges and not quite remember how to be a smile. The Duke had moved on. Everyone said so. The papers had said so. His mother had said so often it had become a kind of incantation in the long galleries of Ashendel House, a charm against memory. Tonight he was to be engaged. Tonight the contracts were to be signed. Tonight, the past was, in the polite, ruthless language of his class, to be considered closed. And here, at the head of his marble stair, stood the past, in a gown the color of unbleached silk, with 2 children no one in this room had ever been told about, and a calm in her face that was not quite a calm at all, but a thing made entirely of practiced effort, held together by counting. 5 seconds, she told herself. You have 5 seconds before he crosses the room, or before he doesn't. 5 seconds in which to be exactly the person you have spent 4 years becoming. She did not look at him. She looked at her daughter, whose chin had begun to lift in a small, defiant imitation of her own, and at her son, whose grip on her glove had tightened in the way it tightened when thunder was still very far away, but coming. She bent, almost imperceptibly, and murmured something the room could not hear. Tobias released a breath. Cordelia released the chin. She straightened. She began to descend. She had rehearsed those stairs too, although not these stairs. She had rehearsed them on the dirt path behind the cottage, with a basket of laundry on her hip and an old shawl pinned to her hair as if it were a train, while a hen of uncertain temperament watched from the gate, and the children laughed because she had told them to laugh, because if they laughed at her practicing, then they would not be afraid when the real night came. The dirt path had taught her something marble could not. It had taught her that you do not descend a stair. You permit the stair to lower you. You let it do its work. You do nothing but exist on top of it, in the right shape, at the right speed, and you let gravity be your servant for once, instead of your judge. So she descended, and the room, which had been remembering how to breathe, forgot again. It is necessary here to step back, to explain as plainly as one can how the woman on the stair had come to be the woman on the stair, and how the man in dark blue had come to be standing beside the swan of sugar and the bride-to-be in aquamarine. 4 years earlier, in a smaller and colder room than this one, in the same house, with no orchestra and no candles and no roses, Adair Whitfield, 8th Duke of Ashendale, had told his wife of 2 years that her presence in his house had become a matter of arithmetic he could no longer balance. He had not shouted. He never shouted. He had spoken from the far side of a long table on which lay a single folded letter and a glass of water he did not touch. He had told her that the contents of that letter had reached his mother first, and then him, and that the contents were such that even a man of his temperament could not, in justice, pretend not to have read. He had told her that she would be permitted the small estate in the north, and a quarterly sum, and the discretion of his name for as long as she did not embarrass it. He had told her that she would leave by morning. And then, because he was the kind of man who believed that fairness consisted of saying every cruel thing at once, so that nothing cruel would have to be said later, he had told her that he did not wish to see her again. She had asked him a single question. She had asked it in the voice she used for the gardeners when something had been planted in the wrong bed, a voice without weight, a voice meant only to confirm the facts. She had asked whether he believed the letter. He had said, after a pause she would later think about for 1,000 nights, that what he believed, and what he could afford to believe, were not, in his position, the same thing. She had nodded once. She had not cried. She had walked out of that room with her hands at her sides, because if she had lifted them to her face, the trembling would have started, and the trembling in that house was not permitted. She had not told him then what she had known for a week, and what the letter had not mentioned. She had not told him because she had counted in the carriage that took her north the precise number of reasons a man like Adair Whitfield might use the knowledge against her, and the number was higher than she could carry alone. She had told no one. Not his mother, who would have used it as a leash. Not her own father, who was dead. Not the physician in the village near the small estate, who had merely raised an eyebrow at her thinness and prescribed broth. She had told only the old woman who came twice a week to scrub the kitchen flags, because the old woman had buried 4 children, and could be trusted to recognize a 5th before it was born, and to keep her mouth shut about it for as long as the world required. The twins had come on a morning in March when the rooks were noisy on the chimney, and the snow on the moor had begun, at last, to consider leaving. Cordelia first, with a small outraged cry that sounded, even then, like an opinion. Tobias second, silent, watchful, with eyes that looked already as if they were trying to decide whether the room was to be trusted. The old woman had laid them, washed and wrapped, into their mother's arms and had said, very softly, that they had their father's hairline and their mother's mouth, and that one of those was a piece of luck and the other a piece of work. Then she had banked the fire and gone to the kitchen to boil water for tea, because the world, having delivered 2 more people into it, was about to require a great deal of tea. For 4 years no letter went south, none came north. The Duke, said the few papers that reached the cottage, was rebuilding the East Wing. The Duke had sold the bay colt. The Duke had been seen at the opera. The Duke had been seen at the races. The Duke had been seen, more recently and with increasing frequency, in the company of the only daughter of the Marquess of Bramble, a young woman of unimpeachable name and 21 summers, whose laugh, according to one columnist who clearly considered himself a poet, was like a small bell rung at a great distance over water. The Duchess of the North read these notices once, and then used them to light the kitchen fire, which was the only practical use she had found for poetry that year. She had not been idle. She had reckoned, on the first night in the cottage, that grief was a luxury her children could not afford, and so she would not afford it either, and she had set about the business of becoming useful. She had learned the accounts of the small estate, which had been kept badly for 2 generations, and she had set them right with a patience that surprised the steward and a precision that frightened him. She had reopened the orchard that had gone to nettles. She had repaired the dovecote. She had taken in 2 girls from the village who had nowhere to go and turned them into a household, and she had taken in the village itself, which had been suspicious of her at first, and then, by degrees, fond. She had taught Cordelia to read out of an old herbal, because there were no children's books in the cottage, and the herbal had pictures of foxgloves. She had taught Tobias to count by giving him real coins and real sums, and treating his answers as if a small empire depended on them. She had carried a great many things alone, and she had carried them so well that after a while she had almost forgotten she was carrying anything at all. What she had not forgotten was the letter. She had not forgotten because the letter, she had come to understand in the long winter of the 2nd year, had not been a letter. It had been a weapon, and weapons have makers, and makers leave fingerprints. The fingerprints, in this case, had been delicate, scented, and unmistakable. She had not acted on them. She had not, in 4 years, written a single word in her own defense. She had decided, instead, to wait, and to grow, and to raise 2 children, and to let the maker of the weapon learn what most makers of weapons eventually learn, which is that a weapon laid down does not stop being a weapon, and that the world has a long memory for those who pretend it does not. The summons to the ball had not been a summons. She had not been invited. The card in her reticule, which the herald had read with such difficulty, had not been issued by the Duke, or by his mother, or by his bride-to-be. It had been issued by a person no one in that ballroom would have suspected. A person who had recently come into a piece of information so unexpected and so precise that it had moved her, after years of careful neutrality, to do something rash. The Dowager Marchioness of Westray, who had once stood as godmother at the Duchess's own christening, and who had not spoken her name in public since the night the letter had been read, had written it with her own hand, and sent it by her own footman, and added in a postscript so small it had to be read twice, the words, "Bring them." She had brought them. Now the marble stair was finished, and the floor of the ballroom received her, and the crowd, with that exquisite instinct by which a crowd of 500 can rearrange itself without seeming to move, parted. It did not part the way crowds part for royalty. It parted the way water parts for a stone dropped from a great height, in concentric, astonished rings. She walked through the center of the rings with a child on each hand, and she did not look at the man in dark blue, and she did not look at the woman in aquamarine, and she did not look at the Dowager Duchess of Ashendel, who was seated in a gilt chair near the orchestra, and whose face had become, very quickly, the color of old paper. She looked instead at the little catalyst of the evening, although she did not yet know that was what he would be. He was a boy of perhaps 7, in a footman's livery cut down to fit him, who had been entrusted with the small and important task of carrying a tray of lemon ices to the children at the back of the hall, and who had, upon seeing Cordelia and Tobias enter, simply stopped where he stood with the tray balanced on his palms and his mouth open. She caught his eye. She gave him, almost imperceptibly, the smallest of nods, the kind one gives a soldier on the same side. The boy closed his mouth. He squared his shoulders in exact imitation of the herald above. He walked, with the dignity of a much older person, directly across the open floor that no servant was supposed to cross during a dance, and he offered the tray to Cordelia and to Tobias, as if they had been the only 2 guests he had been told to find. Cordelia took an ice. Tobias took an ice. The boy bowed. The room, which had been holding one breath, exhaled into another. And the orchestra, blessedly, kept playing, because the conductor was a Frenchman of long experience who had decided some minutes earlier that whatever was happening in his ballroom tonight, the music would not be what ended it. The Duke had not moved. This was important. A man who does not move in a moment that demands movement is doing one of 2 things. He is either incapable or he is calculating. Adair Whitfield, in the 4 years since he had sent his wife north, had not once, to anyone's knowledge, been incapable of anything. He stood beside the swan of sugar with his right hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, and his left hand resting lightly on the gloved hand of his intended, and only the small white area at the corner of his mouth gave any indication that he had recognized, somewhere beneath the surface of his self-possession, what had just walked into his ballroom. He was looking not at his wife, but at the boy. The boy with the watchful eyes, who was eating a lemon ice with the slow gravity of someone who had been instructed not to drip on his coat. His son. Although he did not yet know that word in connection with that face. He was, as those who knew him best would say afterwards, working it out at considerable speed. It was the bride-to-be who spoke first. This, too, was important. Lady Honoria Bramble was 21 and had been raised to believe that the worst thing a woman of her rank could do at a ball was fail to know the correct thing to say within 4 seconds of being addressed. She had not been addressed. She had, however, been looked at by every person in the room except the one on whose arm she stood, and she had decided, with a courage her detractors would later admit had surprised them, that silence was a worse failure than a wrong sentence. She turned her face, which was very pretty and at that moment very pale, toward the woman in unbleached silk who was now standing not 6 paces from her, and she said in a voice that did not shake, "Your Grace." And then, because she had not been raised to lie about what was in front of her eyes, she added, with the smallest possible glance downward, "And these must be your children." There was, at this, a sound from the dowager's chair that might have been a cough, or might have been the beginning of a word that the dowager had decided, in mid-syllable, not to finish. The Duchess of Ashendale, the one in unbleached silk and not the one in the gilt chair, inclined her head with the courtesy due to a hostess in her own house. "They are," she said, "Cordelia, Tobias." She did not present the children to the Duke. She presented them to Lady Honoria, because Lady Honoria had asked, and because in the small private rule-book the Duchess had written for herself on the dirt path behind the cottage, "You answered the person who had been brave enough to speak first." Lady Honoria, to her enduring credit, did not weep, although a lesser woman in her position might have been forgiven for it. She bent very slightly at the waist because she was tall, and she said, "How do you do? with the same grave attention she would have given a visiting ambassador. Cordelia, who had been waiting for an opening, curtsied back. Tobias, who had not, considered the situation for a long second and then offered his small free hand, the one not currently holding an ice, in the manner of a country gentleman meeting another country gentleman at a horse fair. Lady Honoria, after the briefest of glances at her own gloved fingers, took it. She shook it. She returned it. And in the corner of her eye, although she did not turn her head, she was aware of the man on her arm becoming, slowly, the color of someone who has been struck without warning by a thought he should have had years ago. The dowager rose from her gilt chair. She rose the way a glacier rises, which is to say not visibly, but with consequences. She crossed the floor with the white roses, with the swan, with the orchestra still playing because the Frenchman would not give them the satisfaction of stopping. And she came to a halt 3 paces from the woman she had not seen in 4 years and had spent 4 years describing, behind certain doors, as a regrettable episode. She looked at the woman. She looked at the boy. She looked longest at the girl, because the girl had her own mother's chin, and the Dowager of Ashendel had not, until that moment, understood how unwelcome it would be to see her own face in miniature staring up at her without forgiveness. "You have come," the Dowager said, "uninvited." "I have come," the Duchess said, "invited." She did not produce the card. She did not need to. Behind the Dowager, near the doors to the supper room, the Dowager Marchioness of Westray had risen from her own seat and was standing with her hands folded in front of her, and a small, terrible smile on her face. And the Dowager of Ashendel, who had been a girl with her once and knew the smile by heart, understood at once that the card had come from there, and that a great many things were going to be more difficult tonight than she had planned. There was a movement at the Duchess's elbow. The Duke had crossed the open floor. He had crossed it without seeming to decide to cross it. The way a man finds himself at the door of a room he had told himself he would never enter again. He stopped at a polite distance. He did not bow. He did not, yet, speak. He looked at his wife, and for the first time in 4 years, his wife permitted herself to look at him. She had imagined this look. She had imagined it in the cottage, on the dirt path, in the long winter, at the foot of the marble stair. She had imagined it as a confrontation, as an accusation, as a question. It turned out to be none of those things. It turned out to be only a look. And the look was tired, and underneath the tiredness was the thing she had refused, for 4 years, to name. She named it now, briefly, privately, the way one names a wound in order to dress it. Then she looked away. "It is," she said evenly, "your engagement ball, Your Grace. We will not stay long. The children wish to see the cake." This was a lie, and everyone within hearing knew it was a lie, and the lie was so kindly constructed, with so much of the work done by the word cake, that for a moment the entire knot of people around them, the Dowager and the Duke and Lady Honoria and the Marchioness of Westray and the small footman with the now empty tray, were given the option of pretending that this was, after all, only a story about cake. Lady Honoria, who had been raised to take such gifts when they were offered, took it. She turned to Cordelia. "Would you like," she said, "to see it more closely? There is, I am told, a swan." Cordelia, who had already seen the swan and intended one day, in the privacy of her own home, to make a better one, said that she would like that very much. Tobias said that he would also like that very much, and added, with the perfect timing of a child who has been listening more carefully than the adults realized, that he hoped the swan was not real, because he did not approve of cooking swans. Lady Honoria laughed. It was not the laugh the columnist had compared to a bell rung over water. It was a different laugh, smaller and more honest, and the Duke, who had not heard it before, heard it now and registered it, the way a man registers a sound from a house he is about to leave. They went to look at the cake. The Dowager Marchioness of Westray went with them, because she had not stood at a christening for nothing. The Dowager of Ashendale did not. She remained where she was, in the small open space the crowd had made around them, and she looked at the woman she had banished, and the son who had banished her, and she said, quietly, so that only the three of them could hear, "You should not have come." "I should not have had to," the Duchess said. The Duke spoke for the first time. He spoke her name. He spoke only her name, and he spoke it the way one speaks a word in a language one has not used in a long time and is not sure one still has the right to. She let the name fall into the silence between them. She did not catch it. She did not return it. She let it lie there on the polished floor of his ballroom, where it had been dropped, and she waited to see what he would do with it next. "I did not know," he said. "I know," she said. "That is the thing I have, all these years, found hardest to forgive." His mother began to speak. The Duchess raised one gloved hand, only an inch, only enough to make the gesture visible to the two of them and to no one else. And the Dowager, who had not been refused anything in a public room in 40 years, stopped speaking. The Duke noticed. He noticed in the way he noticed everything, which was completely and without comment, and a small piece of the architecture of his last 4 years rearranged itself behind his eyes. "There is a letter," the Duchess said. "You read it once. You will read it again. Not tonight. Tonight is Lady Honoria's. Tomorrow, in your library at 11. You will read it with the seal still on it, because the seal will tell you what the letter did not. You will read it, and then you will decide what kind of man you are, because the kind of man you have been pretending to be for 4 years has, I think, begun to tire you." She paused. She softened very slightly, because she had not come here to wound him in public, and she did not wish to start now. "The children," she said, "do not yet know your name. They know that they have a father. They know that he is a great man in the South. They know that he has been away on business that could not be helped. I have told them no other story. What story they hear next will be the one we tell them together, if there is a together. If there is not, I will tell them the truth, and the truth will be kind, because they are too young for any other kind. Do we understand each other?" He understood her. He had always, in fact, understood her, which had been his particular tragedy. He inclined his head. It was not a bow. It was the gesture of a man acknowledging a verdict he has not yet been given permission to appeal. 11, he said. She turned. She walked, without hurry, in the direction of the cake, where her children were being shown by Lady Honoria the precise place on the sugar swan at which the confectioner had signed his initials in a curl of frosting so small that one had to lean very close to see it. She joined them. She admired the swan. She accepted from the small footman who had reappeared with a fresh tray and an expression of devout concentration, a glass of lemonade for each child and a glass of water for herself. She did not look back across the room at the Duke. She did not need to. She could feel him behind her the way one feels weather. The orchestra, the Frenchman conducting, slid without a seam into a slower air. The dancing did not resume at once. People had begun to talk, very quietly, in the small clusters into which a ballroom organizes itself when something has happened that will be discussed for a generation. Some of the talk was unkind. Most of it, surprisingly, was not. Lady Honoria's mother, the Marchioness of Bramble, who was nobody's fool and had been watching from beside a column, had already made certain decisions about her daughter's future that would, by morning, have rearranged a number of contracts. The Marchioness of Westray was speaking, in a low, pleasant voice, to a small group of dowagers who had once been her enemies, and were now, by the alchemy of a single evening, something more useful. The Dowager of Ashendale had returned to her gilt chair and was, for the first time in many years, not certain what to do with her hands. At 11:45, the Duchess gathered her children. She thanked Lady Honoria for her kindness, with a sincerity that took the younger woman by surprise, and left her, afterwards, thinking for a long time about what kindness was for. She did not speak again to the Duke. She inclined her head to the Dowager, the bare minimum the rules required, and the Dowager, after a pause that her friends would later swear was the longest of her life, inclined her head in return. She walked her children back through the parted water of the crowd, up the marble stair, past the herald with the bell-struck voice, who looked at her this time with something that, in a man of his training, came perilously close to admiration. The footman opened the door. The night air met them. The carriage was waiting. In the carriage, Cordelia, who had eaten 2 ices and a slice of cake and was full of opinions, said that she had liked the lady in the blue dress and did not understand why anyone would marry the man with the tired face when they could marry her instead. Tobias, who had been quiet for an hour, said that he had liked the boy with the tray. The Duchess, who had not allowed herself to tremble all evening, allowed her hands now to tremble against the velvet of the seat, where no one could see, and she said that they had both done very well, and that she was very proud of them, and that they were going to a hotel where there would be hot chocolate, and that tomorrow there would be a great deal to talk about, but that tonight there would only be sleep. They slept. She did not. She sat by the window of the hotel room in a chair that did not fit her, and she watched the gas lamps flicker in the square below, and she counted, as she had always counted, the small things she could still control. The breaths of her children, the hours until 11, the number of times she had imagined this evening and the number of ways it had refused in the end to match her imagination. She did not weep. She had not wept in 4 years, and she did not intend to begin tonight. She did, however, permit herself, for the first time since the long table and the folded letter and the glass of water he had not touched, to set down the things she had been carrying. Not all of it, only a corner, only enough to feel, for a moment, how heavy it had been. At 11 the next morning, she presented herself at the library of Ashendale House. She wore a gown the color of a winter sky, and she carried, in a leather case her father had once used for legal papers, the letter that was not a letter. The Duke was already in the room. He had not slept either. There was a tray of coffee on the table between them that neither would touch. She placed the case on the table. She slid it toward him. He looked at the seal. He looked at her. He looked at the seal again because the seal was not the seal he had remembered from 4 years before. The seal he had remembered had been broken. This one was whole. "You read," he said slowly, "a copy." "I read," she said, "what I was given to read." The original was in the keeping of the Marchioness of Westray, who had been at my mother's bedside the year before I married you, and to whom my mother had entrusted a number of things she did not trust to anyone else. Among those things was the original of this letter, which had been written by a person I will not name in this room until you have read it yourself, and which had been intercepted by my mother's own woman before it could reach the hand for which it had been forged. The copy that reached you 4 years ago was a clever copy. It was not, however, clever enough to know that the original existed. The original, when you have read it, will tell you 3 things. It will tell you who wrote it. It will tell you why. And it will tell you, by a detail in the wax that no forger could have known to imitate, that everything you decided about me on the basis of the copy was decided in error." He did not speak. He took up a small ivory blade from the table. He broke the seal. He read. He read it once, quickly, the way a man reads bad news he is trying to outrun. He read it a second time, slowly, the way a man reads bad news he has accepted he cannot. When he had finished, he set the letter very carefully on the table, aligned with the edge as if the alignment mattered, and he placed his hands flat on either side of it, and he closed his eyes. "It was my mother," he said. "It was," she said. He was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was not the voice he had used at the long table 4 years before. It was a younger voice, and an older one, both at once. "I have," he said, "no right to ask anything of you." "You have," she said, "the right to ask one thing. You are their father. You will ask eventually to know them. I will not refuse you. I will, however, set the terms, because I have earned them, and because the children are not a treaty to be negotiated, but 2 small people who have, until last night, been protected from every cold wind I could keep off them, and I do not intend to stop now. Do we agree?" "We agree," he said. She nodded. She rose. She did not, this time, refuse to look at him. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and what passed between them was not forgiveness, because forgiveness, she had decided long ago, was not a thing one gave in a single morning across a library table. It was something smaller and more useful. It was the agreement to begin. She left the letter on the table. She left the case beside it. She walked out of the library, and the door closed behind her with the soft, definitive sound of a door that has been waiting 4 years to close in exactly that way. The rest, as the dowagers say when they are tired of a story, was a matter of arrangement. The engagement to Lady Honoria was dissolved by mutual consent within the week, in terms so courteous that the columnists, deprived of scandal, were reduced to praising the weather. Lady Honoria, who had discovered in herself on the night of the ball a capacity for honesty she had not known she possessed, declined 3 subsequent offers and went instead to study botany in Edinburgh, where she became, in time, a person of small but real consequence in the matter of ferns, and where, some years later, she married a quiet Scottish doctor who made her laugh the second laugh, the small, honest one, every day of his life. The Dowager of Ashendale retired to a house on the coast that had once been her favorite, and was now, by her own request, to be her only. She wrote on the 3rd Sunday of each month a letter to her grandchildren. The letters were stiff at first. They softened. By the 2nd year, Cordelia was answering them in a hand of her own, in which the chin fortunately did not show. The Dowager Marchioness of Westray was thanked privately in a manner she preferred to the public kind, and continued to attend balls for another decade with the same small, terrible smile, which was now understood, by those who had reason to understand it, to be a smile of approval rather than threat. The small footman with the tray was promoted, at the personal request of Lord Tobias, to the position of under-butler, in which capacity he served with distinction and a slight, lifelong tendency to over-polish lemon ice trays. The Duke and the Duchess of Ashendale did not remarry, because they had never, in the eyes of any law that mattered to them, been unmarried. They lived, for the first year, in separate wings of the same house, and met at breakfast, and learned, slowly, how to speak to each other again over toast. By the 2nd year they were riding out together in the mornings, although they returned by different gates. By the 3rd, they had stopped counting the gates. There was, in the end, no great scene of reconciliation, no kneeling, no speech. There was only one evening in late autumn, a moment in the long gallery in which she paused before a portrait of his grandfather, and he paused beside her, and he said quietly that he had been a fool for 4 years and would prefer, with her permission, to be something else for the rest. She said that she would consider it. She considered it. She gave her permission, and the thing in her that had been carrying for so long, the corner she had set down in the hotel room, set down the rest. And it broke, quietly, in the way she had always known it would. And the gallery, with its tall windows and its indifferent ancestors, was the only witness. And the gallery, being well-bred, declined to comment. And if you have ever stood at the top of a stair you were never meant to climb, with 2 small hands in yours and the whole bright, terrible room of your life waiting below, and counted your steps because counting was the only thing you could still do without trembling, then you already know what it cost her to descend, and what it gave her, in the end, to be seen. Tell me, before you go, which moment of tonight's story you will carry with you into tomorrow. Was it the herald's voice on the marble stair? Or the small footman with his tray? Or the laugh that was not the bell over water, but something smaller and more honest? Or the seal that had never been broken? Or the gallery that declined to comment? Whichever it was, set it down gently somewhere inside you, the way she set down her corner in the hotel room, and let it rest there until the next story finds you. And if you would like the next story to find you here, by this same fire, with the same low light and the same patient company, draw your chair a little closer and stay a while longer, and we will keep a place for you when the candles are lit again. Until then, sleep softly and travel kindly, and remember that some doors take 4 years to close in the right way, and that the right way is always worth the wait. Good night.